A perfect penthouse, a seemingly perfect marriage, and one quiet disappearance that changes everything. On Christmas morning, Clara Vance vanishes without a trace, leaving behind only an engagement ring and a haunting note, "Do not come looking for me." As journalist Ethan Cole begins to investigate, hidden secrets start to surface: betrayal, lies, and a powerful family slowly falling apart. Julian Vance believed he controlled every part of his life until the truth began to reveal itself. This story reminds us of one powerful lesson: silence is not always weakness. Sometimes it is the strength to walk away and begin again. If this story moved you, please support the channel with one like and one share to help us stay motivated to create more dramatic stories for you. Thanks for watching.
The nursery was silent, the Manhattan skyline a sharp constellation of distant ambition, and on the marble top of the changing table lay her engagement ring next to a single devastating server log that would dismantle his tech empire. "You programmed this reality," the scribbled note said. "I'm logging you out." He was on a corporate jet to Aspen with his lead developer, while his pregnant wife connected the data points: the private mountain lodge, the rare book inscription, the woman he'd coded into a future that was already hers. But he never anticipated this variable. She didn't rage, she didn't leak it to the press. She simply vanished with his most critical intellectual property before the first snow fell, and the algorithm of her revenge became a cautionary tale in Silicon Alley. If you think every act of deceit has a final accounting, then you'll want to hear this story, because this is for you. The nursery was finished. Now, Clara Sterling stood in the doorway, holding a small, unpainted, ceramic bird she had been meaning to finish. Her thumb brushed over the smooth, blank space where her daughter's initial was supposed to be. She spoke into the stillness, her voice fracturing on the words. "He didn't just steal our last Christmas. He deleted the source code of our entire future, and I was so deeply invested I never even saw the breach." But that catastrophic realization was still hours away. Our story begins on the morning of Christmas Eve, when Clara still believed in the perfect life she shared with her husband. The Sterling penthouse, perched high above Central Park, was a testament to technological fortune. Snow flurries drifted past the floor-to-ceiling smart glass, blanketing the city in a quiet hush. Subtle, fiber-optic garlands were woven along the windowsills, their warm light the exact Kelvin temperature Arthur Sterling's personal branding team had deemed aspirational for their lifestyle. Inside, a 15-foot fir tree was minimally adorned with custom 3D printed ornaments from their travels to Tokyo and Berlin. Clara, now 8 months pregnant, had been organizing their perfect holiday since dawn. She'd arranged for a private chef to handle brunch. She'd wrapped his gifts in matte black recyclable paper. And she'd just ended a video conference with their acoustical engineer about the final touches on the nursery's sound system. Every detail was optimized. It always was. She was on a low, sturdy step stool, placing a delicate, algorithmically generated glass snowflake on the top of the tree, when she recognized his determined footsteps. Arthur appeared, already in a bespoke wool overcoat, his gaze sharp and distant. His sleek carbon fiber weekender bag was by his side. He looked potent, driven, and a million miles away. He always did. "You're leaving already?" Clara asked, stepping down with practiced care. "I thought the Aspen flight wasn't until 3. He crossed the vast living space and gave her a quick, sterile kiss on her temple, not her lips. She registered the tiny, familiar sting of dismissal and ignored it. "Pushed it up," he said. "This weather system, moving over the mountains, is getting unpredictable. Can't risk being delayed." She nodded, though a tight knot formed in her stomach. Arthur didn't avoid risks. He leveraged them with brutal efficiency. This felt like an evasion. "Are you sure this investor meeting couldn't wait?" she asked, keeping her voice carefully neutral. "It's our last holiday before she arrives, Arthur. They're not going to pull their funding on Christmas Eve, but we will know the difference." He exhaled a short, controlled sigh, the sound she recognized as the overture to an unchangeable decision. "Clara, you know what's on the line. This Aegis launch is the legacy. If I secure this final round, our family is set for generations. I'll be back on a chartered flight Christmas night. I promise." She wanted to object. She wanted to remind him she had put her own promising career as an art curator on hold for this family, that she had endured months of debilitating morning sickness and anxiety alone, that she deserved a partner who was actually a partner. But Clara Sterling didn't create drama. She curated calm. She smoothed over the dissonance and maintained the perfect composition. "All right," she said, her voice almost steady. "Just be safe." Arthur offered her the charming smile that had captivated venture capitalists and her own cautious heart. He laid a hand on her swollen belly, his expression softening into something she forced herself to interpret as love. "I will make this up to us. A month in a private villa in Tuscany after she's born, what do you say? Just the three of us. I'll have Nexus coordinate everything." She allowed the fantasy to soothe her. "It's okay. Go secure the legacy." He picked up his briefcase from a console near the exit. His phone, a custom-built device from one of his own labs, chimed from his coat. He glanced down, reflexively angling the screen away as his thumb moved quickly across it. "Just Nexus, my AI," he said. "Confirming the car is downstairs. I need to run. I'll call you from the plane." She watched him leave, wrapping her arms around her stomach to ward off a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the snow outside. "Arthur," she called out as the door slid open. He paused. "I love you." A shadow of annoyance passed over his face, so quick she could have hallucinated it. "You too," he said, and the door sealed with a soft hiss. Clara remained in the cavernous entryway for a full minute, listening to the silent hum of the private elevator carrying him away. The quiet in the penthouse was a heavy, suffocating weight. She walked back into the living room, fiddling with a single glass ornament on the tree. Her own reflection stared back from the darkened window, a woman who looked exhausted, fragile, and older than her 32 years. When did that happen? The baby kicked, a sharp, sudden pulse, in her sea of anxiety, and she headed toward the nursery, seeking refuge. In the nursery, the air was scented with lavender and new cotton. She trailed her fingers over the pale, Scandinavian maple of the crib. "Your father has to go build the future, little one," she murmured. "But don't you mind him. We are going to have the most wonderful Christmas, just the two of us." She tried to make it sound like a happy secret, but it felt thin and brittle, like a prayer. Her gaze fell on a digital frame on the shelf, cycling through photos from their wedding 3 years ago. Arthur, looking at her as if she were his greatest acquisition, and Clara, looking at him as if he were her entire world. She had believed it, with every fiber of her being. She thought she had finally found a safe place to land. Her laptop, sitting on a plush armchair, pinged with a message. She thought it was Arthur, telling her he'd arrived at the airfield. It was from her sister, Lena, the designated godmother. "Merry Christmas Eve." "How's my favorite little kicker doing?" Clara managed to smile and typed, "Performing an entire ballet on my kidneys. Arthur had to fly to Aspen for an emergency investor meeting." Lena's response was immediate. A tech meeting in Aspen on Christmas Eve. The directness of the question made Clara's throat tighten. She replied, "Yeah, a huge funding round. You know how he is." Lena's reply was a single, damning word. "Sketchy. Call me if you need to vent." Clara closed the laptop and started refolding tiny bamboo fiber onesies, the fabric's softness a small comfort against her rising unease. She breathed in the room's calming scent and fought down the suspicion. It was Christmas Eve. Her husband was securing their legacy. He loved her. She repeated the words in her mind, a desperate mantra. Everything is fine. Everything is fine. Everything is fine. But as the afternoon bled into evening and the city below began to sparkle, an instinct deep in her gut told her it was all a lie. Christmas Eve descended with a profound, isolating silence. The penthouse, once her haven, now felt like a gilded cage. Clara had sent a single text to Arthur, but it still showed as undelivered. She reasoned it was the spotty service over the mountains. She reasoned he was deep in negotiations. She reasoned with lies to quiet the screaming of her intuition. On the central console, the smart home hub glowed softly. He must have left it on voice command standby. She wanted to hear something, anything to fill the void. Nexus, she said, her voice small in the big room, play the latest voice memo. She expected to hear a business note he'd dictated to himself. Instead, a woman's voice, confident and unfamiliar, filled the air. The file was titled Aspen Itinerary. Her blood ran cold. The voice was crisp, clear, and intimate. It was a message for Arthur. I confirmed the private lodge for the entire month, not just the week. Her mind struggled to process the words. A month. The room began to tilt. Her heart beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs. It's for the team. A corporate retreat. A system error. It had to be anything but what it so clearly was. Oh, with trembling fingers, she said, Nexus, show me Arthur's private calendar for this month. The smart screen on the wall illuminated. A block of time labeled ER, Project Phoenix, spanned the next 4 weeks. And there, synced from his financial apps, was a transaction from 2 days prior, a payment to a rare book dealer. The order notes were displayed in stark text. For my Eve, the future is ours. And then she saw it, a recurring calendar entry, every month for the last year. A wire transfer from a personal account to one Evelyn Reed. Her fingers felt like ice. She whispered the name to her laptop's search engine, Evelyn Reed Aegis Dynamics. The top result was a feature in a major tech journal, the genius coder behind the Aegis protocol. The photograph showed a woman with intense eyes and a sleek black bob standing next to Arthur at a conference. He was looking at her with a raw, unguarded admiration that Clara realized with a soul-crushing certainty he hadn't shown her in a very, very long time. A culinary chill, sharper than the Chicago wind whipping off the lake, settled deep in Clara's bones. She was reviewing security footage from the kitchen of Aperture, Leo's newest restaurant, looking for a clip for a promotional video. That's when she found it, footage from his private back office from 2 nights ago. The video was muted by default, but a technical glitch had left the audio track live. The sound was crystal clear, professional, and utterly soul-crushing. He was on the phone with a woman named Genevieve, discussing a culinary investment fund in Luxembourg. And then the line that made her blood run cold. The pregnancy is an unfortunate plating complication, but the timeline works. We get the 3rd star, then I'm done. The life she thought she was co-creating wasn't just flawed, it was a fraudulent recipe, and she'd just seen the final dish. Clara was sorting through expenses for their accountant, her eyes scanning receipts for Leo Vance, the celebrity chef who had taken Chicago's dining scene by storm. It was for their quarterly tax filing. Months earlier, he'd shown her a design for a custom sapphire brooch, claiming it was a commission for a difficult client he was trying to win over. Now she was staring at a post on a famous food critic's blog. It was a selfie of the critic, Genevieve, at a recent awards dinner. Pinned to the lapel of her silk blazer was that exact, unmistakable sapphire brooch. Had you ever seen a single image completely poison your entire memory of a person? Type bitter taste in the comments if you get it. The chamomile tea next to her keyboard grew cold as Clara stared. The high-definition photo, a perfect, glossy testament to her husband's treachery. The brooch was a clue. The name of the Parisian jeweler, Bleu, was a password she'd once seen him type. It unlocked his private cloud storage. Inside was a meticulously kept archive of a second life, flight confirmations to St. Bart's for 2, receipts from competing 3-star restaurants, and password-protected folders with images that made her feel like a trespasser in her own marriage. One email thread with Genevieve, the powerful food critic, was like a punch to the gut. It was dated just before their anniversary trip. Genevieve had written, "Is she ever going to figure it out?" Leo's response was cold and pragmatic. "After the Michelin stars are announced, I need the devoted family man PR. She's too focused on the nursery to see the balance sheets." Clara stared at the words glowing on the screen until they lost all meaning. She's too focused on the nursery. The Gold Coast penthouse, the lies constructed with the same precision as his award-winning dishes. Her hands shook as she dialed Leo's number. He answered on the 4th ring, his voice a sharp, impatient whisper. "Clara? I'm in the middle of a dinner service. Is this important?" She could hear the familiar clatter of a professional kitchen and a woman's throaty laugh nearby that was becoming sickeningly familiar. "Who's with you, Leo?" she asked, her own voice thin and brittle. "My sommelier," he snapped. "Don't be so paranoid, Clara. I'll call you after we close." "Leo, we have to talk. It's urgent." A long, irritated sigh traveled down the line. "Whatever you think is urgent can wait. I have a full house and 2 major critics dining tonight." "More urgent than your wife, who is 7 months pregnant with your child?" she wanted to shout. "More urgent than the son you claimed you couldn't wait to teach how to make his own pasta?" But the words stuck in her throat, choked by a sudden, acidic wave of nausea. She heard the woman's voice again, much closer this time, and a foundational piece of her trust in him crumbled. "Look, I have to go," Leo said. "Enjoy your evening." The line went dead. Clara stood in the vast, echoing silence of their showpiece kitchen. The custom under-cabinet lighting he'd installed glowed softly, completely indifferent to the absolute ruin of her world. Then, a cold sense of purpose clicked into place, and she straightened her back. She walked up the polished oak staircase and pushed open the door to the nursery. The beautiful, hand-carved crib they'd imported from Italy stood under a mural of a gentle countryside scene. This room, a project of their supposed shared future, now felt like a stage set for a life that was never hers. She slid down the wall until she was on the floor, wrapping her arms around her belly as the sobs finally broke through. They were silent, hot, and suffocating. She cried for the future she had poured her heart into, for the man she believed was her partner, and for the life that was now just a collection of spoiled ingredients. When the storm of sorrow subsided, it left something hard and sharp behind. Not anger, not grief. It was resolve. She picked up her phone and called Marcus. Her older brother answered immediately. "Clara, you sound awful. What is it?" Clara's voice was eerily steady, a quiet hum against the tornado inside her. "I need you. Leo is not the man I married. He's not even a convincing imitation." Marcus drove in from Evanston before the sun came up, his sensible sedan holding an overnight bag, and his corporate lawyer's mind already outlining potential motions. Neither had slept. They sat at the enormous marble kitchen island, the lights of Chicago still glittering across the dark lake. Their conversation, a low, focused murmur. As the first pale light of dawn hit Lake Michigan, Marcus's tone was all business. "Show me everything, from the very beginning." Clara turned her laptop toward him. She had used the long, quiet hours to assemble a file on his betrayal, downloading offshore account statements from his cloud, taking screenshots of every single incriminating email, and building an exact timeline of his affair. This was not the peaceful night she had planned, but it was going to be the first night of the rest of her life. Marcus scrolled through the evidence, his expression hardening with every document. The lease for a flat in Paris, the wire transfer receipts to a holding company in Luxembourg. The messages outlined a 5-year business plan that made no mention of Clara or their son. Finally, he looked up at her, his eyes like steel. "This isn't just an affair, Clara. This is a premeditated financial extraction." "I know." "No, you don't," Marcus said sharply. "These transfers. He's using shell corporations to siphon profits and devalue the marital assets. By the time he serves you with divorce papers, he'll claim the restaurant empire is on the verge of bankruptcy. You have to move. First, and fast." Clara clutched her now cold mug. "What do you mean?" Marcus leaned in. "Guys like Leo, with their massive public profiles and egos, they don't just cheat. They orchestrate hostile takeovers of their own lives. When the wife finally realizes what's happening, the money has already disappeared. The lawyers freeze whatever is left, and she's trapped in a legal war she can't possibly afford." "We have a prenup," Clara whispered. "He swore it was just a formality to protect his original investors." Marcus let out a short, harsh laugh. "Of course he did. His legal team wrote it to shield his seed money. It makes no mention of future profits or intellectual property, which is where he's hiding all the value. The good news is, you are entitled to half of all marital income, but only the half we can actually find and prove exists." Clara looked at the mountain of damning evidence on her screen. "So, what is my first move?" Marcus's response was immediate and final. "You vanish. Tonight. Before he comes home and realizes his secret recipe has been compromised." "Vanish? Where on earth would I go?" "To our grandparents' old farmhouse in Wisconsin. It's been empty for years. It's completely off the grid. No internet, terrible cell service, nothing that can be traced back to you. Only the family knows about it." Clara shook her head, her hand moving instinctively to shield her stomach. "I can't just run away. It's not running away when you're protecting your unborn child and your future from a predator. You have every legal right to go there. What you don't have, Clara, is the luxury of waiting." The words hung in the air of the hyper-modern kitchen. Clara glanced at the sleek, imported appliances she had never truly loved, at the temperature-controlled wine cellar and the absurdly oversized 6-burner stove. She had tried to make this apartment a home, but it had always just been another one of his meticulously designed sets. "If I leave," she said, her voice thin, "everything shatters. My entire life." Marcus put a steady hand on her shoulder. "Do you honestly want to stay? In a life built on a deceptive menu, with a man who is planning to discard you and your son like yesterday's leftovers?" Clara thought of Leo's face in the food critic's photo, of the sapphire brooch he had lied about, of his cold, dismissive voice on the phone, treating her and their unborn son like a flawed dish in his grand culinary plan. "No," she said, the word feeling solid and real in her mouth. "I don't want to stay." "Good. Let's get you packed." They moved with swift, quiet purpose. Clara packed only things with real history, following Marcus's instructions. Her passport, birth certificate, her laptop with all the downloaded files, the baby's first ultrasound pictures, and her grandmother's worn, handwritten recipe book. The one thing she owned that had no connection to Leo. She left the designer dresses. She left the expensive jewelry. She packed only the true ingredients of herself. Marcus handled the tech and money, a maximum cash withdrawal from a joint savings account Leo had probably forgotten about, a cheap, untraceable burner phone from a 24-hour convenience store, a paper map with a route to the Wisconsin border that avoided all major tollways and surveillance cameras. As Clara carried the last duffel bag to her car, she paused at the door to his study. The sleek, minimalist space was his command center. She saw the culinary awards lining the walls and the soft glow of his computer monitors. She walked back into the kitchen, pulled the heavy, custom-made platinum wedding band and the massive engagement ring from her finger, and placed them directly on top of his prized, autographed copy of a famous cookbook. Then she placed an antique brass compass on the polished mahogany of his desk and walked out of the mansion, never once looking back. Her son gave a sudden, powerful kick, a firm reminder against her ribs. "Time to find a new true north, little guy," she whispered, her palm resting on her stomach. "Just for us." She slipped into the waiting sedan and met David's eyes. He was sitting in the driver's seat. "You're certain about the island?" David gave a single, solid nod. "I'll text you the ferry details on the satellite phone. Don't speak to a soul. I'll start scrubbing your digital history first thing tomorrow morning." Clara nodded. "Thank you for this, David. You can thank me with a cup of coffee on Orca's Island when you're completely safe." Clara started the car, the engine a quiet purr in the drizzly Seattle gloom. She took one final look at the Bellevue waterfront estate, a fortress of glass and steel that hid a foundation of lies. Then she pulled away from the curb and drove north, heading toward the misty dawn, leaving behind a life that was only a gilded cage, and carrying the only thing that had ever been real. As she drove, a steady rain began to fall, washing the streets clean and covering her tire tracks, dissolving her presence in the city like a watercolor painting. Julian Croft returned to his Bellevue waterfront home on New Year's Day, to a house that was unnervingly still and dark. The first clue that something was amiss was the smart home system. The house's AI, Aura, was offline, something Clara, who distrusted technology, would never have done. A flicker of annoyance turned into a cold dread as he rode the private elevator up from the garage. The flight back from Tokyo had been turbulent. His Gulfstream had hit a rough patch of weather over the Pacific, and Julian was nursing a sake-induced headache while mentally reviewing the tech summit. Sasha had been furious when he'd insisted on coming home a day early. She had wanted to extend their stay in Japan for the week, but perception was currency in his world, and Julian Croft was the meticulous architect of his own image. He unlocked the fingerprint-activated front door and stepped into the echoing silence. The minimalist holiday decorations were still in place, their stark silver lines, reflecting the gray light off Lake Washington. "Clara?" he called out, his voice absorbed by the cavernous main hall. "I'm home." The only reply was the low hum of the server room. He went straight to his home office, the silence of the mansion feeling heavy, like a pressure change before a storm. Everything was in its place. The sleek, custom-designed furniture arranged with geometric precision. But his gaze locked onto the hidden compartment behind a bookshelf, which now stood slightly ajar. On his desk sat the burner tablet he used for discreet communications, placed next to a single, antique brass compass. With a surge of adrenaline, Julian powered on the tablet. It was wiped clean, except for a single, unsent message. "Found my own north." The unlock password had been changed to one word: Orion. The name hit him like a physical shock. He dropped the tablet and sprinted up the floating steel staircase. The nursery, with its interactive mural of the cosmos and advanced biomonitoring crib, was perfect, silent, and crushingly vacant. Their sprawling custom bed was made with architectural precision, the imported linen on her side of the bed, cool and undisturbed. There was no trace of his wife, Clara, who was 8 months pregnant and should have been there. He strode into the massive walk-in closet. Her worn hiking backpack was gone, while her array of designer luggage remained untouched. The climate-controlled vault, where she kept her collection of priceless first-edition novels, was open and empty. A cold knot tightened in his gut. He grabbed his phone, his thumb hesitating over her name, before he dialed. The call went straight to a disconnected number message. A second try yielded the same result. His breath grew shallow as he scrolled to his mother's contact. Genevieve answered on the first ring, her voice as crisp and decisive as a closing argument. "Julian, I'm walking into a board meeting. What is it?" "She's gone," he forced out, the words catching in his throat. "Clara?" he specified. "She took her mother's books, and she's just gone." There was a beat of silence, then Genevieve's voice became razor sharp. "Explain exactly what you mean by gone." "I came home from the summit, and she wasn't here." She left the burner tablet on my desk with a note. The only thing on it was a file named after our project. "And the baby, of course." "I see," Genevieve said, her tone now frigid with contained fury. "What did you do, Julian?" "Nothing. I have no idea why she would just... Do not treat me like a fool. I am not your naive, arts-loving wife." Julian sank onto the edge of their bed, head in his hands. He thought about the encrypted servers, the offshore data havens, the digital fortress he had been so sure was impenetrable. "She knows," he confessed, his voice barely audible. About Sasha. The silence on the other end was absolute. When Genevieve finally spoke, her voice was glacial. "You fool. You arrogant, reckless fool. I warned you that woman was a liability." It was contained, he argued, his own voice sounding hollow. Obviously, it was not. "Do you have any idea where Clara might have gone?" Julian's mind raced. Her parents were gone, and she had cut ties with most of her old friends after they married. David Rousseau, her old editor from her journalism days. But he hadn't heard Clara speak his name in years. "Maybe David," he said. They were incredibly close back at the paper. "Then you need to contact this man immediately and find out what he knows. I will activate my own people. We have to get ahead of this before it jeopardizes the IPO." Julian muttered his assent, but his mother was already moving on. A different feeling was now slicing through his panic, something hot and sharp. It was fury. How could she do this? How could she take his son, his legacy, and just vanish without giving him the chance to explain, to manage the narrative, to regain control? He had given her a world she could never have imagined, a glass palace on the lake, a name that commanded respect across the globe. And this was his repayment? "Mother," he said, his voice hardening into cold steel. "Find her. I don't care about the expense." Genevieve's reply was instant and definitive. "I have a team that specializes in asset recovery. It will be handled with absolute discretion." After hanging up, Julian stood alone in the nursery. The ceiling was a custom star map, displaying the constellations as they would appear on his son's due date. The expensive, silent crib was in the center of the room, a monument to a future that had just been stolen from him. The air smelled of new paint and betrayal. He pulled out his phone and made a second call. Sasha answered, her voice a seductive whisper. "Darling, I was hoping you'd call. My evening just became wide open." Julian's voice was flat, empty of any emotion. "She knows. She took the baby, and she's gone." He heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "Oh, Julian, what are we going to do?" "You are going to do nothing. You will go completely silent and let me handle this." "Do you understand me?" "Yes, darling, of course." Whatever you need. He ended the call before she could reply. He walked to the automated bar in the great room and poured a double of a rare Japanese whiskey, drinking it down in one clean, burning motion. Clara actually thought she could hide from him. She thought she could take his son and just disappear, as if he were some ordinary man she could simply leave. She was making a catastrophic error in judgment. Julian Croft did not lose. Not in business, not with technology, and most certainly not when it came to his own bloodline. He picked up his phone a final time, dialing his head of corporate security, a man who specialized in making digital ghosts reappear. "I require your services," he stated. "My wife has absconded with my unborn son. I want her exact location within 12 hours. The man on the other end of the line quoted a budget that could fund a startup. Julian didn't flinch. "Done. Authorize full deployment of Project Chimera. Use any and all assets." He ended the call and stared out the floor-to-ceiling window, the lights of Seattle glittering across the dark water like a web he controlled. She was about to learn a very hard lesson. The cottage on Orcas Island was at the end of a muddy, unmarked lane, shrouded by a dense canopy of ancient fir trees. The rain had turned the path into a river, forcing Clara to abandon the old car and hike the last half-mile. By the time she fumbled with the key and stumbled inside, she was shaking with cold and exhaustion. But the cottage was a sanctuary. It was safe. It had been in David's family for a century. It was rustic, with no Wi-Fi and not a single bar of cell service, but it was well stocked and completely off the grid. The seaside cottage was stocked to the rafters with supplies, and the pantry held enough non-perishables to get her through the winter. Maya slid the heavy bolt across the solid oak door and leaned against it, placing a protective hand over her belly. The following 3 days were a blur of exhaustion, fear, and the lingering hum of adrenaline. She was a bundle of nerves, jumping at every groan of the old cottage's floorboards. She kept the thick thermal curtains closed and checked the locks on the windows every single night. But slowly, as the immense quiet of the Big Sur coastline enveloped her, an unexpected sense of calm began to settle in. On the 4th morning, she felt the baby give a strong, decisive kick, and for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid. She was just ready. Zoe showed up that afternoon in a rugged electric SUV, its tires gripping the muddy coastal road with ease. The back was filled with more groceries and a set of encrypted hard drives in a waterproof case. She stamped the mud from her boots on the porch and wrapped Maya in a powerful, unyielding hug. "You look like you've been through a war," she said, "but your eyes are finally clear again." "I feel clearer," Maya confessed. "It's so strange. I was sure I would completely fall apart being out here on my own." Zoe placed a small burner phone on the weathered kitchen table. "You were sleepwalking through the last 5 years, Maya. You were so busy playing the part of the perfect, supportive wife for San Francisco's tech wunderkind that you never noticed the poison underneath." While Maya made tea, Zoe plugged the phone into her laptop, a cloning progress bar appearing on the screen. She'd been digging for weeks. On the phone were encrypted chats about shell corporations Maya never knew existed, and transaction logs from crypto wallets moving millions to obscure blockchain startups in Eastern Europe. It was a web of digital fraud that made his affair seem like a footnote. For the past 3 years, he's been using his company's R&D fund to seed these ghost startups, Zoe explained, pointing to a complex flowchart on the screen. These ventures he invests in are designed to fail, making the acquisitions look like terrible business decisions. When he decides to divorce you, he'll claim the company is on the verge of collapse. You'll be left with nothing. Maya stared at a wallet address on the screen. "What are we talking about? In total? Conservatively?" He's funneled at least $50 to $60 million that rightfully belongs to you and his shareholders. The number was dizzying. She knew Ethan could be ruthless in business, but she had never suspected a crime of this magnitude. And it gets worse, Zoe said, her voice low. I started looking into Chloe Vance. She's not just some PR consultant he was sleeping with. An anonymous wallet, one of his, provided the seed funding for her entire agency 2 years ago. What does that mean? It means she wasn't a fling, Maya. She was an asset. He was building his escape route, just waiting for the right time to cut you out of his life completely. A chilling dread crept over Maya. Every tech conference, every philanthropic gala she had so carefully co-chaired, he was a shark using her sterling reputation as his camouflage. He had turned her own trust into a weapon to orchestrate his grand betrayal. What do we do? She asked, her voice calm and sharp. We build an ark, Zoe replied. We save every transaction, every chat log, and when he makes his move, we don't just file for divorce. We give the entire story to Bloomberg and the SEC. For the first time since that sickening discovery, Maya felt something more powerful than sorrow. It was a cold, precise rage that sharpened her focus. She looked at the incriminating blockchain records, then at her brilliant, loyal friend. Tell me everything. They worked for the next 18 hours straight. Zoe, a cybersecurity prodigy, taught her the mechanics of tracing crypto transactions and piercing the veil of digital shell companies. Maya, with her nonprofit director's experience in forensic accounting and due diligence, absorbed every detail, her mind coming alive after years of being deliberately underestimated. By the time they finally paused, the morning fog was burning off the Pacific, and Maya knew her old life was over. But a new one was just beginning. Zoe dished out steaming bowls of ramen at her tiny kitchen table, while Maya watched the rain streak down the window of the outer Richmond apartment. As they ate, the silence between them was deep but comfortable. I thought this would feel different, Maya said, her voice barely a whisper, getting out, leaving all of that. But I just feel hollow. You don't miss him, Zoe corrected gently. You miss the future you thought you had. You miss the life you were so sure you were building together. Maya nodded slowly. I can't stop replaying everything. Every little red flag I ignored. Every time I told myself I was being paranoid. That's not your fault. He's a professional manipulator. It's his core competency. They ate quietly for a moment, the only sound the patter of rain on the glass. You know they're looking for you, don't you? Zoe finally asked. His mother has connections in Silicon Valley that are genuinely terrifying. The money, the power, they won't let you just disappear. I know. Are you scared? Maya considered it. She pictured Ethan's face, the unnerving placidity he had when he was furious. She thought of Eleanor, who saw her as nothing more than a temporary accessory for the Hayes legacy. Yes, she whispered, but I'm more scared of what happens to this baby if they find us. Good, Zoe said, her voice firm. Use it. Outside, the rain blurred the city lights into the darkness. Maya laid a hand on her stomach. For the first time, she let herself imagine a life that wasn't an extension of Ethan Hayes. It was a frightening, unknown world, but it also felt like taking a full breath after being underwater for a decade. She whispered it into the shadows of the small apartment, a vow to herself and the child she carried. We're going to be okay. And for the first time, she thought it might be true. A series of sharp, authoritative knocks at the door destroyed the 3 o'clock in the morning silence. It had been almost a week since she'd fled, and the old apartment building should have been quiet. Instead, the sound echoed down the hallway like a gavel. The insistent rapping came again, harder and more impatient. Maya slipped from the couch, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The cold floorboards bit at her bare feet as she crept to the door and peered through the peephole. Two men, in expensive modern suits, stood in the poorly lit hall. They weren't cops, but they radiated an aura of cold, Silicon Valley efficiency. Oh no, not already. Her hands were shaking so badly, she could barely hold her phone as she tried to call Zoe, who was off the grid testing a client's network. The call went straight to voicemail. Maya tried again, her thumb slipping on the screen. It was useless. She looked through the peephole one more time, and her blood ran cold. The two men were stepping aside for two other figures, Ethan and his mother, Eleanor. Their silhouettes seemed to devour the entire narrow corridor. She had seconds, maybe a minute at most. She scrambled back from the door, her eyes scanning the small apartment, for an escape she knew didn't exist. There was no fire escape, no second exit, no way out of the third-floor apartment that didn't go directly past the four people who had come to retrieve her. Think, Maya, think. Her thoughts were a panicked whirlwind. She could scream. They would brand her as hysterical. She could barricade the door. They would have it broken down and use it as proof of her instability. She was trapped. Another loud, commanding knock on the door made her jump. Maya, it's Ethan. Open the door. I have Dr. Evans with me. Maya stood frozen in the middle of the small living room, her arms wrapped around her waist as if to hold herself together. There was nowhere to go. There was no place to hide. There was only being taken. The knock came again, louder this time. Maya, we know you're in there. We're just worried about you. Please don't make this any more difficult than it needs to be. She started the long, surreal walk to the door, each step feeling like a final, heavy surrender. With a hand that trembled uncontrollably, she undid the chain and turned the lock. The door swung open. Ethan Hayes stepped inside, his handsome face a perfect mask of worried concern. Behind him, his mother, Eleanor, swept in, an expensive Loro Piana coat draped over her shoulders, her eyes as cold and gray as the San Francisco fog. They were with a man Maya didn't recognize, who held a leather satchel and watched her with a clinical, unnervingly calm expression. Did you really think we wouldn't find you? Eleanor asked, her voice a low, condescending purr. Hiding out in your friend's little apartment in the Richmond, my son's security consultants, had your location in less than 12 hours. 12? Did you honestly believe you could win this little game of hide-and-seek? Maya instinctively took a step back, her hand flying to her stomach. How did you— resources, my dear. The right resources can find absolutely anyone. Eleanor's smile was thin and sharp. I've filed for an emergency conservatorship, Ethan said, his tone infuriatingly reasonable. Dr. Evans is here to perform a preliminary assessment. We're here to get you the care you so clearly need. An assessment? What are you talking about? I haven't seen any paperwork. One of the men from the hallway stepped forward, holding out a thick envelope. His voice was flat. Mrs. Hayes, your husband has petitioned the court for an emergency psychiatric evaluation, citing grave concerns for your mental state and the welfare of your unborn child. You are hereby ordered to attend a hearing at the Superior Court of California in 48 hours. My mental state? Maya's voice trembled with fury. That's ridiculous. I am this baby's mother, a woman who drains a multi-million-dollar portfolio and vanishes from her own home? Isabel countered, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. Who leaves behind a rambling, incoherent letter and then ghosts every single call and text. That isn't the behavior of a rational person, Clara. It's the mark of someone completely unhinged. I found the plans for the other penthouse, Clara finally screamed, the accusation ripping through the sterile quiet of the lobby. For Nina's apartment, the one at the Lakeshore Sanctuary. I know about the trust you set up, the off-the-books construction budget. I know it's been you and her all along. You've been lying about our entire marriage. I ran to keep our son away from you." Marcus didn't even flinch. His expression was a carefully constructed mask of deep, agonizing concern. "Do you see, Doctor? The paranoia, these wild, baseless theories. This is precisely what I was trying to explain." The man holding the leather briefcase finally spoke, his voice smooth and calming. "Mrs. Thorne, I'm Dr. Albright. I'm a clinical psychologist. Your husband has asked me to provide the court with an impartial third-party evaluation. The best thing for everyone, especially you, is to cooperate fully. Just come home to the Gold Coast, Clara." "Let's sort this out privately," Marcus pleaded, his voice a gentle, persuasive hum. Clara's gaze shot from Marcus's feigned worry to his sister, Isabel's smug triumph, then to the doctor's professional neutrality. She scanned their faces, desperate for a crack in their story, a flicker of belief in hers, any sign of shared humanity. There was nothing. They were a united front, a fortress of wealth and influence, pushing a narrative that had already condemned her. "What choice do I have?" she whispered, the words barely a breath. "You have 48 hours to respond to the motion," the doctor stated, his tone matter-of-fact. "If you don't, a summary judgment is likely. Considering the evidence of instability, Mr. Thorne will almost certainly be granted exclusive parental rights once the baby is born." Clara felt the polished marble floor of the skyscraper's lobby seem to drop away beneath her. The entire glittering world she inhabited, tilting on its axis, the life she had designed, the security she had taken for granted, the overwhelming, ferocious love for her unborn son. It all dissolved in the perfectly filtered air. Isabel moved closer, her signature jasmine perfume, a scent Clara once loved on holidays, now smelled toxic and predatory. Her voice was a velvet-wrapped threat. "Come home, Clara. Play the devoted wife. Let the family's PR team manage this. If you fight him, if you turn this into a public spectacle, I will personally finance a story that paints you as such a dangerously unstable mother. You'll be lucky to get supervised visits in a state-run facility. Is that the future you envision for your son?" Clara's hand flew to her belly, a protective shield for the child floating inside, completely unaware that a corporate-style hostile takeover of his life was underway. To the Thorne dynasty, he wasn't a baby. He was the next heir, a legacy asset to be controlled. A raw scream clawed at her throat, a frantic impulse to bolt past the security desk and lose herself in the Chicago crowds. But Isabel was right. They had the money, the connections, the story that was already being sold. They held all the cards. "Fine," she choked out, the word a shard of glass in her throat. "I'll come home." "We knew you'd see reason," Isabel said, her smile as thin and sharp as a paper cut. "You were always so pragmatic." As the lawyers began murmuring about schedules and affidavits, as Marcus motioned for his driver to pull the town car up front, as his sister stared at Clara's swollen belly like it was a prized piece of real estate, Clara made a vow. This was not a surrender. She was being checkmated in a building she herself had helped design, but the real fight for her child had only just begun, and she would shatter their immaculate, carefully curated world into a million pieces before she let them take him from her. The Thorne Tower was a monument to ambition, a sheer cliff of dark glass and steel piercing the Chicago skyline. Inside, the only sound was the reverent whisper of immense wealth being leveraged and compounded. Clara sat on a stark, white, leather couch in a 40th floor meeting room, her knuckles white from clenching her fists. Her attorney David was beside her, his face a knot of fury as he scrolled through a file on his tablet. "This is a coordinated assault," David spat, his voice a low growl. "Judge Harrington, who's been assigned your hearing, He's been a member of the same exclusive golf club as your father-in-law for 20 years. Marcus's family has made that man a fortune in real estate tips. He had an absolute duty to recuse himself from this case. He won't, Clara said, her voice devoid of emotion. They've planned for everything. We have to file a motion demanding his recusal. They'll just deny it. Then we take it to the appellate court. And pay for that with what, Clara? He's frozen everything. Every card, every joint account, every investment. David looked at his client, at her pale but resolute expression, and felt his professional detachment cracking. He was beginning to understand that they weren't just up against a powerful husband. They were fighting a family empire that played by its own set of laws. The massive oak doors of the courtroom swung open. A clerk called out their case number. Clara stood, her legs unsteady, and walked into the room where her life was about to be dismantled. The courtroom felt less like a public chamber and more like a private tribunal, paneled in severe, dark mahogany. Marcus was already at the respondents' table, flanked by a woman infamous in Chicago's legal circles as the Lioness, Catherine Finch. He refused to look at Clara, staring forward with the perfect posture of a man wronged and deeply concerned. In the gallery directly behind him sat Nina, observing the scene with the calm, patient focus of a predator who knows the hunt is already over. And beside her, poised and professional in a chic maternity dress that emphasized her own pregnancy, was the woman carrying his other child. Seeing her there, in this place, felt like a punch to the gut. All rise for the Honorable Michael Harrington. The judge strode in, a man with a full head of silver hair and an air of unshakable authority. He offered a curt, almost invisible nod toward Marcus's table, before his gaze swept over Clara and David with utter disinterest. We are here to address the emergency motion regarding the mental fitness and immediate custodial rights concerning the unborn child of the Thorne Union. He looked to Catherine Finch. Ms. Finch, you may proceed. Catherine rose, her presence instantly dominating the room. Your Honor, my client, Mr. Marcus Thorne, comes before you today out of a profound and immediate fear for the safety of his unborn son. On March 5th, his wife, Clara Thorne, experienced a total psychotic break, abandoning their home on the Gold Coast, cutting off all communication, and demonstrating extremely erratic and dangerous behavior. Clara had to physically stop herself from leaping to her feet and screaming that the proof of his lies was on a hard drive in her bag, in a file labeled Lakeshore Sanctuary, detailing his entire, calculated betrayal. But David's firm hand on her wrist was a silent, desperate command. Not yet. Miss Finch went on, her voice unwavering as she held up a thick, spiral-bound report. We have also commissioned a preliminary psychological evaluation from Dr. Albright, who is prepared to testify that Mrs. Thorne's recent behavior is consistent with a severe case of antenatal depression, which includes paranoid delusions and presents a significant potential risk to the child's welfare after birth. Clara leaned in, whispering fiercely to David, I met that man once, for 5 minutes, at a fundraiser 3 years ago. I know, he whispered back. We'll shred his credibility on the stand. But when David rose to object, Judge Harrington dismissed him with a dismissive wave of his hand. The evaluation was sought by a concerned husband. Your objection is on the record, counselor. The following hour was a surreal, horrifying piece of legal stagecraft. Nina Reyes was called to the stand, not merely as a witness, but as the main act. She introduced herself as the lead designer for Thorne Properties, and then spun a convincing narrative of Clara's supposed decline into what she termed disturbing professional jealousy and paranoia over the last several months. She became obsessively suspicious, Nina said, her voice dripping with counterfeit sympathy, She started inventing these bizarre conspiracies about secret projects and hidden funds. I was there several times when she had very public and unsettling meltdowns at board meetings. Clara stared at the woman who had helped plot the demolition of her life, and who was now committing perjury to steal her child, and a deep, penetrating cold seeped into her bones. When Clara's lawyer, David, tried to introduce the Lakeshore Sanctuary blueprints as proof of a conspiracy, Judge Harrington immediately shut him down. This is a hearing about the imminent well-being of a minor, counselor, not a marital tiff. Mr. Thorne's private real estate ventures have no bearing on this matter. Your Honor, his methodical plan to defraud my client of her child is directly relevant to his character and fitness as a parent. The objection is sustained. Move on to a different line of questioning, counselor. But there was no other line. Every piece of damning evidence Clara possessed, every file, every email, was ruled inadmissible or irrelevant. Every single argument Ben presented was systematically torn apart. It was painfully obvious that the outcome had been determined long before they stepped into the room. The decision was handed down with sickening efficiency. In light of the evidence and testimony provided, Judge Atherton announced, the court awards temporary sole, legal, and physical custody of the child following its birth to the father, Mr. Arthur Sterling. Miss Morgan will be permitted supervised visitation, contingent upon the results of a comprehensive psychiatric assessment. No, Chloe whispered, her legs giving way as she tried to stand. No, that's not possible. He's fabricating everything. They're all fabricating everything. Miss Morgan, compose yourself, or I'll have you escorted from my courtroom. Please, she cried, her voice cracking. Please, that's my child. I'm the mother. But the court officers were already approaching, and Arthur was getting to his feet, his expression a perfect mask of somber triumph. Chloe was paralyzed, watching as her entire world was dismantled by a legal decree. As they walked by, Arthur's mother, Eleanor, shot her a look of pure, icy victory. Chloe's eyes met Arthur's for a brief, terrible second, and she saw only the cold, detached satisfaction of a major real estate deal finally closing. She collapsed into Ben, a deep, animalistic sob of raw despair tearing from her lungs, a sound of absolute devastation. She'd been completely outplayed. They'd won. They had seized everything from her before she even had a chance to hold it in her arms, and she had been utterly helpless to prevent it. The air in the room at the roadside inn, just off the Mass Pike, was heavy, with the scent of industrial cleaner and hopelessness. The cheap laminate flooring was warped near the window unit, and the fabric on the armchair was worn thin from the anxieties of countless other guests. A sprawling, faint water stain on the ceiling resembled a faded map of a country she would never visit, but the room was only $60 a night, and her savings had been drained to a meager $415. It had been 4 weeks since that day in court, 4 weeks of dreading the inevitable, of existing under the threat of a judicial order that would make her son's birthday the day she lost him, and in sterile, lifeless conference rooms where she was allowed to hold her own baby for 2 hours as a court-appointed supervisor, paid by her husband, documented every murmur, every touch. It had been 3 weeks of sleeping in a dingy motel after he had the electronic locks on their Beacon Hill brownstone reprogrammed. 3 weeks powered by lukewarm instant coffee and protein bars, as she tried to figure out how to start a new life when every single avenue was blocked. Arthur's legal team had acted with ruthless speed. They used her prenatal emotional distress to justify an emergency hold on all their joint accounts. They had her legally barred from their historic home. They claimed it was a flagship, showcase property, essential for his real estate empire's image. They had successfully twisted her desperate drive to her brother's home in Cambridge into an act of reckless endangerment, presented as evidence of her unstable mental condition. They had demolished every foundation of the life she had built, piece by piece, leaving nothing but ruin. And that afternoon delivered the final, devastating blow. Chloe sat on the lumpy mattress, staring at the document her lawyer had forwarded to her. The message glowed on her phone, the words stark against the screen, like a death sentence. A critical witness, a former project manager at Arthur's firm, had recanted his entire statement. In a new affidavit, he now claimed that Chloe Morgan had attempted to bribe him to concoct a story of an affair against her husband. The document was flawless, expertly written, and utterly damning. He got to him, Ben had said over the phone, his voice thick with exhaustion. I don't know what leverage he used, Chloe, but it was effective. That man was our only credible proof of a coordinated character assassination. What about filing for a change of venue? That motion was dismissed. Judge Atherton is remaining on the case, and the judicial conduct complaint we lodged against him has simply disappeared. His network is just too powerful, Chloe. I've never encountered a case so thoroughly rigged. So, what do we do now? The silence that followed on the other end of the phone felt like a physical weight. I have nothing. There are no options left. I am truly, deeply sorry. Chloe ended the call and sat in the quiet, enveloped by a stillness that felt more suffocating than any sound. Outside the grimy motel window, life went on, as if hers hadn't just shattered. Headlights streaked down the highway, cutting through the evening haze. The neon sign of a nearby diner blinked to life. It advertised all-day breakfast and free refills. Somewhere out there, someone was living a normal life, worrying about normal things, tucking their child into bed without a stranger taking notes. Her fingers found the TV remote, and she began flipping through channels without really seeing them. Then, a segment on a local news channel made her blood run cold. Boston's real estate visionary of the year. The story was about Arthur, who was accepting an award at a charity ball, the polished logo of his development firm, Sterling Properties, displayed on a screen behind him. He was suave, confident, and completely insulated from the ruin he had created. His tailored tuxedo was impeccable, his smile exuding absolute power. He looked like a man who had never faced a single hardship in his life. And standing beside him, with her hand placed deliberately on a small but undeniable baby bump under her couture dress, was Isabella Rossi. She was radiant, glowing with the serene confidence of a woman who had won. The reporter's voiceover said, Real estate titan Arthur Sterling with his partner and lead architect, Isabella Rossi, who are expecting their first child together. Chloe felt the words reverberate through her. Their first child, as if her own son, Noah, had been completely erased from the record. She felt like an irrelevant footnote in the epic of Arthur Sterling, a man who was supposed to be the center of her own story. She imagined her son, Noah, asleep in a nursery in that cold, perfectly designed brownstone, looked after by hired help instead of his mother. Her mind replayed the 120 minutes she was granted each week, a cold, observed performance that could never come close to being enough. For a moment, she considered just letting the despair consume her. Her phone buzzed, the sound violent in her suffocating grief. Unknown. Caller. She almost declined it. What else could there be? More terrible news? Another attorney telling her the fight was over? More proof that the world was designed to protect men like Arthur, and she was just the collateral he could sweep aside. But a strange impulse made her accept the call. Is this Chloe Morgan? The voice was a woman's, low and cautious, with a slight digital distortion, as if it was being scrambled. Who is this? My name is not important right now. The information I have for you is. Look, if this is another journalist trying to get a quote, you can save your breath. I have nothing to say. I am not a journalist, Miss Morgan, the woman replied, and the use of her maiden name sent a chill through her. I am another one of Arthur Sterling's casualties. Chloe's breath hitched in her chest. She gripped the phone so tightly her knuckles went white. What are you talking about? A thick, tense silence stretched across the line. When the woman spoke again, her voice was quieter, infused with the unmistakable echo of old pain. Check the message I sent you on the Old Arch Review alumni forum. You need to be very careful. He has people everywhere. He is always listening. How did you get my information? Who are you? Someone who wouldn't let him erase me. Just read the message. We can talk after you have. The call ended with a soft click, leaving Chloe in a deafening silence, her heart pounding a wild rhythm against her ribs. With a hand that shook, she opened her laptop and went to the dusty, long-forgotten architectural forum. A new private message was there. The subject line was blank. Inside, there was no message, only a link to a secure file-sharing site and a single phrase below it. The key is Gropius 76. It was the name of the architect she wrote her thesis on. He did this to me too. You are not losing your mind. You are not the only one. She clicked the link and entered the key. It unlocked a folder filled with scanned legal papers. The first was a court filing from 6 years prior, a petition for an emergency conservatorship. The subject of the petition was Dr. Evelyn Reed. The petitioner was her business partner, Arthur Sterling, who claimed a complete psychological breakdown and gross professional malpractice, an ex parte order. Chloe felt a deep cold settle into her marrow. Arthur had a partner before he launched his solo firm. His mother had mentioned her once. A brilliant but volatile architect who suffered a breakdown and vanished after selling her interest in their company. Such a tragedy, his mother had said, with a wave of her hand. Not everyone is built to handle the kind of pressure Arthur thrives on. But Evelyn Reed hadn't just vanished. According to these documents, her own partner had used his influence to have her declared mentally unfit. She was held in a private facility for 4 months, heavily sedated, and denied access to her own lawyers and family. She was released only after she signed over her 50% ownership in their budding firm for a pittance and agreed to a non-disclosure agreement so restrictive it essentially scrubbed her from the history of Boston architecture. When they let her go, she simply ceased to exist. Isabel sifted through the contents of the lockbox, a knot of ice forming in her stomach with each yellowed document. She found forged environmental impact statements from consultants who sat on the boards of Arthur's other companies, offshore transfer slips showing he'd drained their joint investment funds the day before filing for divorce, and affidavits from local officials that were clearly bought and paid for. The very last file was a copy of an open letter Lena Petrova had written to the press, a letter that was never published. He engineered a smear campaign to make my colleagues and the media believe I was a hysterical, radical activist, it read. He had journalists on his payroll, politicians in his debt, and a law firm that would ruin anyone for the right price. By the time I realized what he was doing, it was over. He had already stolen everything. My research, my professional standing, my life's work, my entire future. If you are reading this, it means he failed to silence me completely. For the love of all that is good, do not let him do this to anyone else. Isabel's eyes fixed on the date. 7 years ago, Dr. Lena Petrova had escaped the career grave Arthur Sterling had dug for her. She had endured. She had pieced her life back together from the ashes, and if Lena could survive him, so could Isabel. She pulled out her phone and dialed the faded number from the sticky note. A voice answered before the first ring finished. "Tell me everything," Isabel said, her own voice no longer a shaky whisper, but the sharp, clear crackle of freezing water. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, her voice was unwavering. "Tell me everything." The woman on the other end of the line now went by Lena, a name she had taken back for herself. She had shed her old identity like a heavy coat, leaving it behind with all the other things Arthur had poisoned. Lena told Isabel she was now a university lecturer, living a quiet life in a small Oregon town, a ghost who had systematically scrubbed her own professional history from the public record. It had taken her 7 years to rebuild her sanity, to learn to trust her own judgment again, and to carve out a life that was not defined by his calculated destruction. But she had never stopped watching. For years, Dr. Lena Petrova had kept a silent, encrypted vigil on Arthur Sterling's real estate empire. When her alert systems flagged a pattern of aggressive asset shuffling and legal maneuvers targeting his pregnant wife, Isabel, she recognized the blueprint of a familiar attack. It was time to emerge from the shadows. "I have spent nearly a decade building a complete profile of his operations," Lena said, her tone clinical and sharp. "Tracing his shell corporations, following his money laundering. But I was a nobody, a disgraced consultant. My word alone meant nothing." "So why are you calling me?" Isabel asked, her voice barely audible. "Because every other person he has destroyed was bound by suffocating non-disclosure agreements or financial ruin. You, Isabel, are the first person he couldn't entirely bury. I knew that if my evidence could be combined with your story, we might finally have enough power to bring his entire world crashing down." That first phone call spanned almost 4 hours. Lena walked Isabel through the digital trail of devastation she had compiled. The terrifyingly consistent pattern of finding a brilliant collaborator, exploiting their expertise, and then manufacturing a scandal to justify their removal. "Before me, he did it to a master builder in Kyoto," Lena explained, "an artist named Kenji Tanaka. Arthur partnered with him to build a hotel, stole his unique structural designs, then had him blacklisted with a fabricated story about him using faulty materials. And before Kenji, there was a historical preservationist in Lisbon. He took her research, used it to acquire a protected landmark for pennies on the dollar, and left her to take the fall for bribery." "How many has he done this to?" Isabel breathed, a profound chill seeping deep into her bones. "That I can document with hard proof? At least 4. But I believe the real number is far greater." A dizzying wave of sickness washed over Isabel. All those gifted people, all those lives ruined, while Arthur never suffered a single consequence. His family's old money and legal firepower had constructed an impenetrable fortress around him, rebranding his predation as sharp business acumen. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice shaking with a new kind of fury. "We take this to the one person in this state who has been trying to prosecute him for years." 2 days later, Isabel was sitting in a sterile government office overlooking San Francisco Bay, across a desk from a woman named Maria Flores. She was a California Assistant Attorney General with piercing, weary eyes and the quiet intensity of someone who had seen the city's wealthiest monsters up close and was thoroughly unimpressed. "Mrs. Sterling," Flores began, her voice crisp and professional, "I have had an active investigation into your husband's development projects for almost a decade. Suspected bribery, racketeering, permit fraud. But every time my office gets close to an indictment, our sources get scared, evidence vanishes, and some very powerful people in Sacramento start making phone calls. So, you know he's a criminal? I know he operates as if the law doesn't apply to him, and he has surrounded himself with a network that ensures it doesn't. Then why hasn't he been stopped? Flores leaned forward, her expression turning grim, because knowing a man is a shark and proving it in a court of law are two entirely different things. I need a source from inside his personal life, a credible witness who can testify to his methods. And up until now, every single person he's betrayed has been too terrified to go on the record. Isabel thought of the child growing inside her. She thought of Jenna Thorne's latest social media post from a charity gala, a perfectly manicured hand resting on the small swell of her own stomach. I'm not terrified anymore, Isabel said. The next 3 weeks were a blur of intense preparation. Maria Flores's team of state investigators worked with Lena, cross-referencing her years of research with their own intelligence, building an airtight chronology of corruption. Isabel was given a discreet recording device, masterfully hidden inside a vintage Cartier brooch, to wear during her divorce settlement meetings with Arthur, designed to capture his unguarded narcissism. The trap they laid was brutally simple. Isabel would be the one to initiate contact. She would call Arthur, her voice sounding broken and defeated, asking for one last private meeting to sign the divorce papers. His colossal ego would make it impossible for him to resist one final chance to see her concede defeat. And when he arrived, expecting to find a shattered woman, ready to beg, he would instead walk into a reckoning. The meeting was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon at their penthouse apartment, overlooking the Golden Gate Bridge, a glass palace they were in the process of selling. Isabel had insisted on the location, knowing its layout, the specific echo in the main gallery, and the blind spots in its security, ideal for concealing the Attorney General's listening devices. She showed up early, her heart hammering against her ribs, but her fear had been burned away, leaving only cold resolve. A state investigator named Chen was with his team in a vacant apartment 1 floor down, listening to the live audio feed from the living room. When Arthur Sterling entered, he was precisely as she remembered, wearing a perfectly tailored suit, radiating an unshakable aura of absolute power. You wanted to discuss the terms of your surrender, he said, not as a question, as he took a seat in a leather armchair. Go on. Isabel sat on the sofa opposite him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to hide their trembling. I want to see my son when he's born, she said, her voice quiet. I want to be his mother. Then stop all this nonsense, he answered, with a casual, dismissive gesture. Sign the papers. You know your place. My place? Arthur's smile was a well-honed weapon, the same one he had used to convince her she was his partner. Now she saw it for what it truly was, the cold, polished steel of a predator. You were never meant to be a partner in the business, he said, his tone condescendingly gentle, as if explaining something to a child. You were a beautiful accessory, a brilliant designer, a charming hostess, the perfect wife to complete the picture. But you started asking questions, Isabel. You started looking into parts of the empire that were not your concern. And I do not share control. Isabel could feel the small, cool weight of the brooch on her dress, a tiny anchor capturing every single word. What about the Costa Verde project? She asked, her voice perfectly level. Was that my concern? The shift in Arthur's posture was instantaneous. The sophisticated mask of casual superiority dissolved, exposing the raw, predatory chill beneath. Where did you hear that name? He hissed. I found the old land surveys, Arthur, the suppressed reports. I know you buried Lena Petrova's research to build that resort. He surged forward, planting his hands on the coffee table between them, his voice a menacing growl. That land was worthless, just like her career is now. It had an obstacle, so I removed it. If you pursue this, you will face a similar removal. Is that a threat? It is a fact of business. Isabel met his furious gaze for one long, silent beat. Then she shifted her eyes to a sculpture on the mantelpiece, where she knew a lens was hidden. I think the Attorney General of California has everything she needs, she said, her voice suddenly ringing with absolute clarity. The doors to the private elevator slid open. Federal agents swarmed the entrance to the gala, and for the first time in his meticulously orchestrated life, Arthur Sterling appeared genuinely, utterly stunned. The arrest of the real estate magnate on charges of money laundering and tax evasion sent tremors through Boston's elite circles. Society blogs and local news channels cut to live footage of him being escorted in handcuffs from the grand ballroom of the very museum wing that bore his name, his face a grim tableau of disbelief and cold fury. The clip became an instant sensation, echoing through every private equity firm and philanthropic board, dissected endlessly by commentators. Real estate tycoon Sterling arrested in federal sting. Sterling Properties implodes amid fraud scandal. More partners emerge in Beacon Hill money laundering scheme. The list of indictments was breathtaking: conspiracy to defraud, tax evasion, and laundering illicit funds through fine art, a scheme that unraveled after one of Arthur's former accountants came forward with a ledger's worth of incriminating documents, followed by two rival gallerists Isabel had never even met. This was no longer just a messy divorce. It was a public spectacle, exposing the rotten core of the city's high finance world. Mark had cautioned Isabel that the legal battle would be a grueling marathon, a war of inches, and that Arthur's legal army would try to drown them in paperwork to shield him. But some justice was served quickly. 3 days after the indictment, Sienna Reed was caught on camera by celebrity photographers as she left a prestigious auction house, having tried to consign a multi-million-dollar sculpture Arthur had gifted her. A federal injunction had frozen every single asset he had ever transferred to her. Her art gallery, built on a curated image of emerging artistic voices, but secretly bankrolled by Arthur's dirty money, imploded in a hailstorm of public scorn. Her rambling, tear-streaked interview on a morning news show became an internet joke, a permanent digital epitaph for her spectacular implosion. That nonprofit for fostering young artists she had launched to great acclaim, forensic audits exposed it as a shell corporation for moving cash. Eleanor Sterling, Arthur's commanding mother, was suddenly a pariah in the Brahmin society she had ruled for half a century. The boards of the symphony and the historical society politely requested her resignation, and old friends who once vied for a spot at her dinner parties were now perpetually unavailable. The Sterling name, once a golden ticket into the most exclusive rooms in New England, was now radioactive. For Isabel, though, the only victory that truly counted arrived 6 weeks later, in a Suffolk County family courtroom that felt worlds away from the penthouse where her life had been dismantled. A pragmatic, no-nonsense judge was presiding. She had closely examined the evidence from the federal investigation, listened to the damning wiretaps from Arthur's office, and read the federal reports. She then issued her judgment. Sole legal and physical custody of the infant child, Lily Sterling, is hereby granted to her mother, Isabel Sterling. Mr. Arthur Sterling is prohibited from any and all contact pending the outcome of the ongoing federal criminal trial. Furthermore, this court finds Mr. Sterling in breach of the prenuptial agreement through acts of gross financial deception, thereby voiding the agreement and awarding the petitioner significant punitive damages, along with sole ownership of the primary marital properties. Isabel felt the judge's decree wash over her. Full custody, her future secured. She had won. Mark gave her shoulder a firm squeeze, a grounding touch in this bewildering new chapter. The sterile silence of the family center was almost unbearable, but Isabel's focus sharpened to the click of a door handle. A caseworker led a small boy into the room. Miles spotted her immediately. His face, which had been tight with anxiety for weeks, lit up with a brilliant smile as he pulled his hand free. "Mommy!" he shouted, the sound like pure sunshine. "Mommy, you came!" It was the anchor she had been missing. He said it again, a joyful, urgent refrain. In a single motion, Isabel was on her knees, catching her son as he launched himself into her arms, a deep, ragged sob escaping her with the force of a tidal wave. Lily, her baby daughter, gurgled in the carrier beside her as Miles wrapped his arms tight around her neck, his little fingers twisting into her hair. "I'm right here, my love," Isabel managed to say, her voice thick with emotion. "I am here, and I am never, ever going away again." The year that followed was a period of deliberate reconstruction. Isabel used the settlement to leave Boston and purchase a small, charming bookstore in a quiet town on the coast, a world of paper and ink far from the cold gleam of Arthur's glass towers. It was all hers. She rediscovered her passion, using her curator's eye to build unique collections and host community author nights. The work lacked the prestige and glitter of Arthur's universe, but it was real, and it was mending something inside her. The baby, a cheerful girl named Lily, thrived. She learned to crawl on the worn oriental rugs of their own small house. Her first word was book, often declared, while pointing a tiny finger at a colorful picture book. In a home filled with the scent of old pages and the sound of laughter, instead of suffocating silence, she grew into a toddler who felt completely safe and cherished. Isabel still had moments when her heart would seize, the bold architecture of a new building, the sharp scent of a man's expensive suit. She still had nightmares about being locked out of her own home. She could still picture Arthur's dismissive smile if she closed her eyes for too long, but she was rebuilding her life, one chapter at a time, one customer recommendation at a time. One brilliant autumn afternoon, while sitting on a bench overlooking the harbor, as Lily napped in her stroller, a man in a worn corduroy jacket sat down at the other end, a collection of poetry in his hands. His name was Daniel, a literature professor at the local college with kind eyes and a son, Leo, who was a few years older than Miles. He was simply soaking up a rare moment of peace between lectures. He didn't ask why she jumped when a loud boat horn sounded from the water. He offered no hollow platitudes. He just read his book, told her an amusing story about a local sea captain, and eventually asked if she'd like a cup of coffee from the shop across the street. "Yes, I would," Isabel replied, and the simple truth in those words felt like a revelation. Her phone buzzed with a news alert. A quick glance at the screen sent a wave of profound calm through her. Arthur Sterling, sentenced to 15 years in prison, all assets forfeited. She slid the phone back into her purse and looked at her sleeping child, at the seagulls circling overhead, at the man walking back toward her, with 2 warm cups and a quiet smile. He had taken so much from her, she thought, her trust, her sense of security, her faith in the future she was creating. But he couldn't take this. He couldn't steal her story. Her bookstore manager waved from the doorway, and Miles gave her a thumbs up from the children's section window. Lily stirred, toddling over with a colorful picture book she'd pulled from the stroller basket. "Mama," she said, holding it up like a sacred offering. "Story." Her face was a picture of absolute contentment, and Isabel felt the last jagged piece of her broken spirit settle gently into place, not with a crash, but with a quiet, steady hum. She knelt to take the book from her daughter. "It's a beautiful one," she whispered. "Let's go inside and read it together." They walked toward the warm light of the bookstore, their hands linked. The sea breeze was crisp. The future was a book not yet written. And for the first time, in what felt like a whole other life, the book curator, Isabel Sterling, was eager to see what was on the next page.